After a decade-long boom in house prices, the past 12 months have been a real turning point. Real house prices have already fallen 13%, and last month Rightmove reported that average asking prices have fallen by £6,000. But some commentators feel that the worst is still to come, due to the effect of higher interest rates and a deteriorating economy. Back in 2008, house prices fell 20% in a short period of time. But so far, house prices in nominal terms have not fallen that quickly, only 3 or 4%. We shall look at what the experts are saying is going to happen to house prices in 2024. But first, let's try to understand why housing transactions and housing demand have fallen really quite sharply. And will this translate into lower prices? Since 2010, UK house prices soared by nearly 90%. Yet this was at a time of weak economic growth and almost stagnant real wages. A period of ultra-low interest rates, combined with quantitative easing, caused a boom in asset prices, which was great news for homeowners, but increasingly pushed house prices out of the reach of first-time buyers. The ratio of house price to incomes rose to record levels. The ONS measure 9 times income. The nationwide measure shows house price to incomes reaching historically high levels. Schroders stated house price to incomes were the most overvalued since Queen Victoria was on the throne. And in the past year, there's only been a tentative revaluation, with studies suggesting that house prices have not caught up with the new circumstances of higher interest rates. And then on top of these historically high prices, rising interest rates were like a double whammy. The cost of mortgages has soared. In 2020, with mortgage rates at 2%, a household paying £1,000 a month mortgage payment could borrow £235,000. But with mortgage rates rising to 5%, the same household could only borrow £171,000. That's a big reduction in the amount that people can borrow. Now, higher wages to some extent have offset that a little bit, but basically buying power is much diminished. And this is reflected as we see a fall in demand and fall in mortgage lending. For first-time buyers, mortgage payments as a share of income have increased from 27% to 37%. And this is at a time of cost of living pressures with high inflation, student loan repayment and very unaffordable rent increases. So this has been especially difficult for the younger generations struggling with all these cost of living pressures. Though it is worth noting that payments as a share of income are not quite as bad as the early 90s and 2008. Now, in recent months, mortgage rates have slightly decreased from the midsummer peaks when inflation was far exceeding expectations. However, it is a mistake to think that the impact of rate increases will fall away. The Bank of England recently produced a report, and they said that 2/3 of the effect of higher interest rates are still to be felt. What that means is that in 2024, high interest rates will increasingly bite and affect the economy. In 2008, variable mortgages were common, but in recent years, 2- and 5-year fixed deals have become the most common type of mortgages. As these expire in the next few months, many mortgages will face substantially higher mortgage repayments, up to an extra £500 a month. And as more people pay higher mortgages, it will cause an increase in mortgage arrears. Already there's been an 18% increase in arrears in the past year, and combined with stagnant real wages and a weak economy, this will force more to sell their house in 2024. And as the supply of homes on the market increases, this will put more downward pressure on prices. During COVID, we did see fewer houses coming onto the market, and this relative shortage of new homes for sale was definitely a factor in propping up prices. But in recent months, more homes are coming onto the market. People are wanting to sell, and this would have a definite downward effect on prices. Now, for much of 2023, we've kind of seen a standoff between buyers and sellers. This is why transactions have fallen so much. But the recent reported drop in asking prices of £6,000 fall is quite significant of what might happen in 2024. Frustrated sellers are realising that they have to price more realistically within current market conditions. And it shows that the housing market is never straightforward. because there are numerous time lags. It takes time for higher interest rates to impact the market, and when it does, it takes time for sellers to reluctantly reduce asking prices. And even if interest rates were to be marginally cut in 2024, there would still be a depressing effect from all the past 14 interest rate increases, which have still not been fully felt. In recent years, the market has also been inflated by government policies such as Help to Buy. This was a government scheme which attempted to solve the overvalued house prices by enabling first-time buyers to borrow even more. It was great for home builders like Persimmon and Barratt, who saw their share prices almost triple, and this helped accelerate the rise in demand and stretch affordability even more. But even the House of Lords claimed that the £29 billion Help to Buy scheme merely inflated house prices and represented bad value for the taxpayer. It would have been better, for example, to invest in social housing where there's a real shortage. The end of Help to Buy is quite significant because it reduces demand further just at a time when it's most vulnerable. Now, the final point is that some might say interest rates of 5% are nothing, and it's true that in 1992 interest rates were 15%, and this helped to cause house prices to fall 20%, and a price decline which lasted 4 or 5 years. However, it's not strictly comparable, because the rapid increase in house prices mean that interest rates have a much bigger effect today than they did in the past. One study suggests that an interest rate of 6% is the equivalent of 13% a couple of decades ago. And the reason is that deposits have increased so much, mortgage payments have increased, that even a small increase in interest rates can have a very big impact in increasing your monthly repayments. Also, on top of all the housing market woes, there's another factor to consider, and that is the state of the UK economy. Technically, the UK avoided a recession in 2023, but growth has been very stop-start. Real wage growth has been stagnant in the past few years, and the tax burden has risen to a post-war high. So many households have been left with quite high debt burdens, low savings, and we see already a fall in retail sales because the economy is quite vulnerable. And in this challenging climate, it's very difficult to raise a deposit. Average deposits have grown to over £50,000, and according to the Resolution Foundation, it can take 14 years on average to save for a deposit. And if the economy was to deteriorate with rising unemployment, this would be devastating for the housing market, reducing demand and forcing people to sell. The final factor which may affect the housing market is that markets are still adjusting to the end of zero interest rates. As interest rates rise, bonds become relatively more attractive than assets like housing, which are giving at the moment quite a relatively poor rate of return, whereas bonds give you a high rate of return, good interest, but also much more security and less hassle. It is another factor that's making buy-to-let much less attractive at the moment. So you could say that this is the case of the prosecution, why prices are overvalued and why prices have to fall. But if prices have only fallen 3 or 4% in the past year, given the 14 consecutive interest rate rises, is it not the case that so-called experts, which you might say includes YouTubers like me, are over-exaggerating the case that house prices have to fall? Well, there are some factors that are limiting house price falls, and it's worth examining these and how important they are. The first factor is that we've had a lot of inflation in the past few years. Nominal wages have risen 17% in the past couple of years. This means that rising nominal wages are increasing nominal buying power. And this is why the fall in real house prices is much greater than the fall in nominal prices. If we deflate house prices using RPI, there's been a really big fall in real house prices. So inflation itself is helping to make housing less overvalued. Last month, the ONS reported nominal wages were rising at 8%, yet inflation in the same month fell to 4.6%. This is good news for both the economy and the housing market. We are seeing both now rising real wages and positive real interest rates, a rarity in the UK in recent decades. But there are two caveats to this recent good news. Firstly, it is highly unlikely that this kind of nominal wage growth will be maintained. Secondly, the fall in inflation was widely anticipated because of the one-off fall in energy costs. If we look deeper into the inflation figures, we see that service inflation is running at over 6%, and this is a better guide to underlying inflationary pressures in the economy. So there's still a long way to get inflation down to the government's target of 2%. The government's target isn't just to halve it from 10 to 5 like Rishi Sunak wanted us to believe. The Bank of England still has a long way to go. Now, there are some forecasts that interest rates may fall as early as May. And in March, I took out a variable mortgage rather than a fixed rate because I was optimistic, or perhaps a better word was hopeful, that rates wouldn't stay that high for too long. But even a minor fall in interest rates would not necessarily cause prices to rise. Don't forget that for all these time lags, we still haven't had the impact of all the past 14 rate increases. The Bank of England do report that by the end of 2024, they could forecast inflation could fall to 2%, the government's target. And if that forecast is proved right, and their track record is not very good, but if they do head towards 2% or even lower, then it's quite unlikely interest rates will remain anywhere close to 5%. But it is worth stressing that's a long time down the road. There's still a long way to go to get there, and there's still a big negative effect of all the past interest rates to come into effect. Also, it's important to bear in mind it's not just interest rates that affect house prices. The biggest house price falls in recent memory occurred during a deep recession of the early 90s and 2008-09. So, if some external shock or even internal pressures push the UK economy into recession, this would be a really significant downward pressure on house prices, no matter what happened to interest rates. A rise in unemployment always has a very big negative effect on house prices. Another factor with regard to the housing market is the issue of supply, or more accurately, the lack of supply. The UK has a rising population, partly caused by net migration. Yet the UK, as you're probably well aware, frequently, if not always, fails to meet government targets for house building. The relative lack of supply is often put forward as a reason for high house prices and why prices may never fall. And it is true to some extent that, the UK had built an extra 1 million homes in the past decade. There would be more downward pressure on prices at the moment. However, it's important not to overstate the role of supply. As a rough rule of thumb, for every 1% increase in supply, prices may be 1% or 1.5% lower. So if, for example, Labour actually built 1.5 million houses, prices would be around 8% lower than they otherwise would have been. In the short term, it's really changes in demand, interest rates, wages, unemployment that affect prices. Supply is more of a long-term factor. Now, at this point in any discussion on the housing market, people usually want to chip in with their own personal anecdote. Maybe in your area prices are still rising, or maybe on your street people can't sell even if they cut from 10%. And that's because there's no such thing as the UK housing market. It's very regional, and even within a region, prices and housing can vary significantly. But it does mean that house price falls are likely to be concentrated in the south, areas where higher interest rates are having the most effect. But do feel free to leave a comment about what you are noticing about house prices in your area. Another complication for the housing market is that at the moment there's a lot of uncertainty, even controversy, about what is actually happening to house prices. Housing data is not an exact science. Each index has its own methodology. And if fewer houses are sold like there were in 2023, it becomes much harder to come up with a national index. For example, Nationwide rely on mortgage lending data. But if mortgage lending has fallen dramatically, and if houses are more likely to be sold by cash buyers, it becomes much more difficult to construct a national index. The ONS measure uses the land registry data of houses and their actual selling price. But there the problem is there's quite a long time delay, 6 to 12 months before people report what the house sold for. And so when we see their prices, we're really seeing what's happened in the past rather than what is happening now. And if you look at the, RICS survey of surveyors, this shows that sentiment is really quite negative about house prices, and sometimes this can be as good as any measure. But at the very least, it's always good to not place too much emphasis on monthly changes in prices. So what are experts predicting for house prices in the coming year and years? Well, there's quite a degree of variation, all the way from virtually no change in prices, all the way through to drops of 35%. Though it is worth bearing in mind that is over the course of a few years from peak to trough. And it is worth bearing in mind, if you look at the 1990s house price fall, there the correction lasted for 4 to 5 years. So sometimes the housing market can be quite slow to readjust to changing conditions. Quickly going back to the first graph, why did prices fall so rapidly in 2008 and not 2023? It was because in 2008 there was a global credit crunch and recession. Banks virtually stopped lending. At the moment, we don't have anything like this. There's been better regulation since 2008 with less subprime mortgages, no self-certification mortgages, and banks are stress testing at higher mortgage rates. So although arrears have risen, they are nothing like the mass repossessions we saw in the early 90s. So where does that leave us for 2024? The average consensus of forecasts is a steady decline. And I tend to agree with that. I tend to be on the more pessimistic scale. I think that prices will fall maybe 15% peak to trough. But a lot will depend on the state of the economy, because often it's been a deep recession that's caused a big fall in house prices, like the 90s and 2008. And but I also am aware that inflation is doing a lot of the heavy lifting of revaluing house prices. An interesting question is what will happen to the house price to income ratio. It reached very record levels in 2022, started to fall. It will definitely fall more. But would it fall to levels we last saw in the early 90s at around house price of 3 times income? I mean, I would like it if that happened because it would be much more egalitarian, enable people to actually buy a house rather than it being priced out. But unfortunately, I can't quite see that happening. Although it's going to fall, I can't see it getting anywhere close to that level at the moment due to the wealth in the economy and a shortage of supply. But I would kind of like to be proved wrong. We'll have to see. If you are interested in past housing crashes and the lessons we can learn for today, this video goes into more detail on how bubbles burst. And if you found this video useful, please do give it a thumbs up and do subscribe to the channel. Thank you.